York Hostel seemed to come straight out of a horror movie. It also snowballed from day to day, so that by the final night, things were becoming very hectic indeed. I think those people were lucky that they could leave the following day, otherwise the disturbances would have got even worse. When children are involved in a group like that, it's best to get them out as quickly as possible and back to their own homes. But, you know, in a way the adults brought all that on themselves, because what they were doing was reliving an ancient fairy story, exploring the forbidden room. They were told that a part of the building was off limits, and they went back to it again and again and again. And every time they did that, the disturbances got worse. But let's leave the possibility of evil forces for the time being, and instead turn to some ghosts that are much less threatening. There's some ghosts that inspire a great deal of affection in living people.
The Rocks, a small area nestling in the shadows of Sydney Harbour Bridge, probably has more ghosts per square kilometre than any other spot in the country. The British settlement of Australia began here on January the 26th, 1788, when Captain Arthur Phillip sailed the first fleet into Sydney Harbour. From that time onwards, it has been an ideal breeding ground for ghosts, built by convict chain gangs which suffered the continent's first whippings and hangings. Despite high hopes for the colony, the Rocks became a haven for thugs, drunks and prostitutes, and the site of Australia's first prison. Later, it became a slum area, and in 1900 there was an outbreak of bubonic plague. Poorer residents were forced out so the infected buildings could be fumigated or demolished. The surviving buildings are now being restored by the Sydney Cove Redevelopment Authority, the sort of conservative semi-government body which would normally never believe in ghosts. The trouble is that its own information centre, in a former coroner's court and mortuary, is haunted by a mischievous ghost which the staff have nicknamed Fred. It first appeared to an office manager who saw the apparition of a young man which called out, "I am innocent." The current information officer, Josephine Christensen, has no fear of Fred. In fact, she seems rather fond of him.
Do you know anything of the history of Fred or why he may be haunting this place?
No, I wish Fred would tell us. I'm sure we'd all be very pleased, because if he's upset, we'd like to help him. He doesn't seem to do anything very bad to us. I mean, we coexist with Fred. We say good morning to him when we arrive in the visitor centre, hoping that we'll put Fred in a good mood for the rest of the day.
Quite often people sense a presence in a building even though they don't see anything or hear anything. Do you sense a presence here at all?
Well, I think this is simply because of the stories we've had. We do. We sense Fred. We'll come in the mornings and a lot of our display material will be on the ground. And we can see no apparent reason for this except that Fred doesn't like it there. And we put it back. And sometimes we put it back so often and it falls down that we just don't put it back anymore. And Fred wins in our eyes.
There's another Fred, about 100 kilometres away from Sydney, at Campbeltown. Every November, the city holds one of the world's most extraordinary festivals to celebrate the ghost of an ex-convict murdered in the town 160 years ago. For 6 days, the town develops ghost fever, and thousands of people line the streets for a parade of decorated floats, pipers, brass bands, and ghosts in costume. It's all in honour of Australia's most famous and cherished phantom, the spirit of a ticket-of-leave convict called Fred Fisher, who once operated a small farm on the edge of town. The legend of Fisher's ghost is part of Australia's folklore, but the story is founded on historical fact. Fred Fisher was an industrious man determined to rise above his convict past. He worked hard on his small property and enjoyed the friendship and respect of the townspeople. He was last seen alive one afternoon in 1826, mending fences in paddocks near a small creek. Court records show that while he was working, Fred was visited by a more prosperous farmer called George Worrell, who argued with him over the location of the boundary between their two properties. But the terrible fate of Fred Fisher wasn't discovered until months later. It's not the brutal murder of Fred Fisher that the people of Campbeltown celebrate every year. It's his ghost. The story has come to symbolize the triumph of good over evil and the victory of a little Aussie battler over the bigger bloke. As far as the townspeople knew, Fred Fisher had simply vanished. And in the weeks that followed, George Worrell fabricated the story that Fisher had sold him his farm before fleeing to England to escape a forgery charge. Worrell began selling up Fisher's goods, and although the townsfolk were suspicious, nothing could be proved. He had disposed of Fisher's body by dragging it to a small creek and burying it in a shallow grave. About 3 months after Fisher's disappearance, a local resident, John Farley, came rushing white-faced into the local pub, claiming he had seen Fisher's ghost sitting on the handrail of a fence. He said the apparition had slowly turned and pointed towards the creek. And a short time later, Aboriginal trackers guided police to the body at the exact spot indicated by the ghost. Worrell was arrested, convicted, and hanged for the crime. The story became legend, and for the past century and a half, locals have claimed that Fisher's ghost can sometimes still be seen sitting on the fence, pointing accusingly to where he was dragged by his murderer. The historic Princess Theatre in Melbourne is the home of a third well-loved ghost called Fred. It's the apparition of a noted opera singer, Frederick Baker, who died in the theatre under the most bizarre circumstances imaginable. On March the 3rd, 1888, Frederick was playing the demonic role of Mephistopheles in a production of Faust. In the final scene of the opera, Mephistopheles returns to Hades with Faust, and Fred, in crimson costume, descended to hell amid theatrical smoke and flames through the stage trapdoor. A platform operated by ropes and pulleys carried Fred below, but he suffered a heart attack on the way down and died without speaking another word. It seems Fred couldn't accept missing out on the final bow, because from the moment he died, strange events were recorded at the Princess Theatre. His ghost has become a theatrical legend. The phantom is known to generations of theatre folk as Federici, a glowing human shape whose appearance spells good luck for any forthcoming production. And Federici has appeared to scores of people over the past century.
As a matter of fact, it was right here. I was sitting where I am standing now, and my back was towards the house, and Malcolm Phillips, who was directing the play, unfortunately Malcolm's now dead, but he was looking out into the theatre and he said, "There he is, the poor old bastard." And I said, "Who?" And he said, Fred, he's out there in the circle. So I really had to build myself up to it. It was not my favourite moment at that moment of time. And I turned around and there he was up there in the circle. And the theatre had gone cold. And I became conscious of the smell like old lavender. You know that type of smell if you go into an elderly lady's home and you get open linen drawers and you get that strange lavender type smell. But what we saw was a shape of white light like that, with a diffused grey light around it. All I can say is that's what happened to me right here on this stage, and whatever it was up there.
We've just seen two non-threatening but very different ghosts. Federici at the Princess Theatre seems to linger on for no apparent purpose. Fisher's ghost suggests two possibilities. The first is that his spirit survived death and came back to give information about the murder. The second possibility is that his observer gained telepathic information from the murderer's mind and dramatized this up into a projected apparition. But our next ghost is quite different. In fact, it may not be a ghost at all. It's a kind of force which brings out the violence in people, and it exists in Clarkfield Hotel, which has the reputation of being the most haunted building in Australia.